Imagine if half the people you'd ever met suddenly disappeared. Half the doctors, half the teachers, half your friends, half your family. Gone. Out of the blue. Victims of a terrible disease with no known cause and no known cure. That is the reality that Europeans faced between 1346 and 1353, when the bubonic plague, better known as the Black Death, swept the continent. Lords locked themselves in their castles to keep the infected away. Towns barred their gates to travellers. Priests and doctors struggled in vain to save victims from what must have seemed a judgment from God. The Black Death changed the face of Europe forever. Its effects were so devastating that it still has an impact on our bodies today. So how did people survive the Black Death? If we could get in a time machine and go back to the 14th century, would we make it out alive? It turns out there was a secret key to survival, something that helps explain who lived and who died. But before we can understand that, we need to understand the disease itself. Be forewarned, the descriptions are pretty graphic. Bubonic plague is one of a few types of plague. It gets its name from the swollen lymph nodes, or buboes, caused by the disease. The nodes in the armpit, groin and neck can become as large as eggs and can ooze pus. Other side effects included blackened tissue from gangrene, often involving the fingers or toes, or unusual bleeding, dangerously high fever, trouble breathing and or coughing up blood, nausea and vomiting. Honestly, the list goes on for longer than I'd care to elaborate. The bubonic plague kills 80% of its victims within 8 days, and yet unbelievably, the bubonic plague is considered one of the lesser deadly plague variants, behind septicemic, which attacks the blood, and pneumonic, which attacks the lungs. It's also a wild fact that all of these diseases still exist, and despite being treatable, are still contracted by a few thousand people every year, killing just over 10% of that number. But we have modern medicine and antibiotics. Without those, the deaths would still be catastrophic. In the 1400s, barely 10 in every 1,000 people who contracted the disease survived. But little did people know, there was a physical secret, unknown to humanity for years to come, that determined a large part of whether you lived or died. But we'll go into detail on that later. Most people today think of the Black Death as a uniquely European disease. However, the effects were felt worldwide. It is thought that between 35 and 50 million lives were claimed by the plague in Europe alone. But people often fail to remember that the plague also infected India and spread through North Africa as well as Asia. Europe had a smaller population than China. In terms of deaths, it's likely the plague did more damage in China. It is estimated that with Asia included, the death toll rise from 35 to 50 million up to between 75 and 200 million. In fact, much evidence points to the Mongol Empire being one of the earliest transmitters of the disease, from Asia into Europe. Mongol armies likely contracted the plague during their trade along the Silk Road, Asia's main artery of trade, and according to stories of the siege of Kafar in Crimea, Mongol soldiers catapulted plague-ridden corpses into the city, spreading it amongst their besieged rivals. At which time, Genoese merchants fled the city by ship, bringing the Black Death along with them, heading now for Italy. The plague arrived in Europe in October 1347, when 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. People gathered on the docks were met with a horrifying surprise. Most sailors aboard the ships were dead, and those still alive were gravely ill and covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. Sicilian authorities hastily ordered the fleet of death ships out of the harbour, but it was too late. From there, it spread primarily through fleas on the backs of rats that permeated every European town and city. With the lack of understanding as to how it started, there were many religious explanations for the plague. Christians believed it was a punishment from God for humanity's sins, but other sources pointed the blame at witchcraft and sorcery, and individual life choices including one's piety or lack of it. In fact, during this time, the Roman Catholic Church saw one of its greatest dips in faith, with many people turning to more immediate, visceral forms of worship in the form of local mysticism and other blasphemous religious divergences. The flagellant movement quickly gained popularity in Europe, and the pace at which its reputation grew in 1348 was almost as rapid as the spread of the plague itself. Flagellation, or the practice of wounding one's body as a form of religious penance, had been performed long before the arrival of the plague, but the flagellant movement reached its peak in Europe during the Black Death. The majority of society felt that humanity was being punished by God for its sins through the destruction of the plague, and their solution was to punish themselves in hope of receiving God's mercy. The abbot of St. Giles at Tournai said, on the growing groups of flagellants, quote, "Men were inciting one another and gathering in crowds of 200, 300, even 500 and more, depending on the size of the local population. Since no one really had an answer, either religious or scientific, the two explanations were blended and shared many of the same short-sighted conclusions and methods of coping. The spread of bad air, or miasma, was the most popular misconception of the age, giving birth to much of the iconography that we now associate with the Black Plague. Many preventative measures dealt with eliminating said miasma. The three main diagnostic methods used by physicians were astrology, uroscopy, and pulse taking, all of which, of course, did nothing to dispel symptoms or reduce infection. Chaos erupted. Social norms were abandoned, and the economy underwent abrupt and extreme inflation. Since it was so difficult and dangerous to procure goods through trade and to produce them, the price of both goods produced locally and those imported from afar skyrocketed. Funnily enough, as a peasant, if you didn't die, your financial situation was vastly improved by the sudden lack of competition. Because of illness and death, workers became exceedingly scarce, so the demand for people to work increased vastly. The need for people to work the land was so high that it threatened the lord's manorial holdings. Servants were no longer tied to one master. If one left the land, another lord would instantly hire them. The lords had to reform their ways to make the situation more profitable for the peasants and so keep them on their land. In general, wages outpaced prices and the standard of living was subsequently raised. But this very slight silver lining was very rarely capitalized upon without tragedy affecting anyone. Just about every community in Europe was struck directly by the plague. So even if you were lucky enough to have your family remained untouched, you could be sure that your friends and neighbours weren't so lucky. It wasn't until 2022 that scientists learned that luck had nothing to do with survival. There was a surprising reason that some whole families remained untouched while others disappeared from history, something that no one would understand for another 674 years. Like previously mentioned, social norms and standings drastically changed. As a consequence of the beginning of blurring financial distinctions, the fashions of the nobility became more extravagant in order to emphasize the social standing of the person wearing the clothing. The peasants became slightly more empowered and revolted when the aristocracy attempted to resist the changes brought about by the plague. In light of the chaos, the aristocrats had no choice but to give in to their demands, lest they be overrun and killed, or have their entire workforce vanish. Such frustration and disloyalty was common during this time, even amongst people's own class. As you can imagine, as an individual living amongst the plague-fraught Europe, mistrust and conspiracy were a large part of human interaction, as a seemingly harmless interaction with one of your closest relatives or friends could mean death within a week. Mothers abandoned husbands and children, and vice versa, for fear of catching the contagion. Some towns barricaded themselves, afraid to let anyone in who was not already there, and equally afraid to let anyone out. Sometimes houses were burned to the ground with the inhabitants inside if they were known to be ill. Ordinary parish burial grounds were insufficient to hold the massive numbers of dead, and new plague cemeteries were opened. People of that period thought warm baths permitted plague miasma to enter humans' pores, so public baths were closed. Victims' clothes and possessions were thought contaminated and burned, and cats were killed as possible transmission agents. So-called plague doctors wore protective clothing with a long cape, mask, and a bill-like portion over the mouth and nose containing aromatic substances, partly to block out the putrid smell of decaying corpses. Perhaps an early version of the modern hazmat suit. Although the reason behind the creation of the plague doctor's apparel was flawed, in practice the outfits seemed to work as a kind of medieval PPE, protecting the wearer against infectious bodily fluids and respiratory droplets from the infected bites of fleas. The treatment offered by plague doctors were varied and largely ineffectual. The treatments could involve the draining of blood and fluids from buboes, or the prescriptions of medicines that induced vomiting or urination. Such treatments were usually chosen in an attempt to balance the bodily humours. Medieval doctors may not have had any idea how to treat the disease, but modern scientists have recently uncovered the secret to surviving the Black Death. Research done from October 2022 suggested it was more than luck that determined who lived and who died. Analysis of centuries-old DNA from both victims and survivors of the Black Death identified key genetic differences that helped people survive the plague. Genetic material extracted from skeletons buried in a graveyard in Kyrgyzstan, where tombstones referred to a mysterious pestilence, revealed the DNA of the plague bacterium in 3 people who died in 1338, several years before the disease entered Europe in 1347. This is the earliest example we have of the Black Plague, and the closest we have to its origin. And it seems that your likelihood of survival is to do with your birth, but not how you may think. Further research that took samples from bodies during the time of the plague in London and Denmark were compared, and after vast, extensive comparison of genetic and homozygous data, it found that if you were born with a particular ERAP2 gene type, that you would be over 40% less likely to contract the bubonic plague. Said gene type would leave you actually weaker to infection, but much stronger when it came to limiting bacterial growth and spread. So would you survive the plague if you got in a time machine and travelled back to the 14th century? No one can say for sure, but you'd stand a better chance than most at the time, particularly if your distant ancestors were survivors. That genetic legacy continues to shape the human immune system today, with genes that once conferred protection against the plague now linked to greater vulnerability to autoimmune diseases such as Crohn's and rheumatoid arthritis. We can also draw a lot of similarities and knowledge from the research on the Black Death to modern diseases and pandemics. During the Black Death, minority groups such as Jews were persecuted for supposedly spreading the disease. It's a pattern that echoes across history, as one group marginalizes another amid a sea of anxiety and fear and irrational hatred. Sound familiar? If we can learn anything to take with us in our day-to-day lives from the time of the Black Death, aside from the fact that nature will decide genetically who lives and dies, it would be that during a pandemic, it's probably best to give ourselves all the best chance of survival by avoiding unnecessary contact, using PPE, and not to jump to polarizing and violent conclusions. But humans are smarter than they were back in the 14th century, right? Right? If you like this video and would like more fun facts and interesting takes on history, subscribe to History Snob for more. We hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next video.